So I recently wrote a blog post in which I outlined one of my main piano goals for 2021, which is to broaden my active repertoire, or basically increase the number of pieces that I can play. I then did a video where I talked about one of the main barriers to doing this, which is that as amateur pianists, we tend to choose pieces that are too difficult for us in terms of our ability or the available time that we have to learn them and practice, or both of these things. And this severely limits how many pieces we end up being able to play at a reasonable standard. Now, it would seem to be that the fix for this is obvious. You just choose easier pieces. But in that video, I talked about some of the reasons why it's actually not that easy to do. And also shared how even though I had this realization when I was trying to play the Chopin Second Ballad about a year ago, it was just taking me forever to learn it and it wasn't really getting up to scratch. I'd resolved not to make this mistake again and went and made exactly the same mistake again, choosing another difficult piece that was taking me ages to learn. So it's certainly one of those things that's sort of easier said than done. So one way around this problem is to limit the amount of time that you have to learn a piece. In other words, learn pieces in shorter spaces of time. Do what's called quick studies. Now, these are sometimes done as part of school curriculum or at university, but are often overlooked in favor of, the emphasis, I guess, has to be on the pieces and repertoire that you're learning for the exam, for the grade you're on, or for the end of the year concert or whatever. It's a pity because it's the few that I was forced to do, they were a bit traumatic given the pressure that you find yourself under, but were incredibly useful. And I think I learned quite a lot from doing them, and I think I do regret not having done more. But basically, the philosophy behind doing a quick study is that let's assume that the quality with which you want to be able to play is going to be at a certain level, and even if you're going to learn something quicker, you're still going to want to be able to play a piece at a reasonable level. You want to enjoy playing it, and you want your audience to enjoy listening to it. So you may cut some corners, and maybe the bar is set not quite as high as something that you'd learn in the space of a few months or years, but it's got to be pretty close to that. Now, if you're cutting the amount of time that you have to learn the piece, one obvious way to then learn it to meet that requirement would be to just practice a lot more. I'm also going to assume, and I think it's reasonable to assume, that the amount of time that you have to practice is not going to be possible to be significantly increased. I think we all, particularly as amateurs, we live in a time-starved age where there's just so many competing demands on our time. So I don't think it's realistic to suddenly increase how much time you spend practicing. And also, as I'll mention later, that might not even be desirable anyway, because often the more time you spend practicing, the more time you waste practicing ineffectively. So if those are the constraints that we have, the only other option is to choose pieces that are perhaps a bit shorter and a bit less demanding in terms of, from a technical perspective and learning the notes. And as a way to illustrate this, if you had a spectrum, on the one end you've got a sight reading where it's something that you've literally barely seen, so you don't spend much time learning it at all, in fact you just scan through it. The quality is going to be such that you're going to hope to get most of the notes, maintain a pulse, and have something more or less recognizable as the piece that you're trying to play. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the repertoire that you would spend many months learning and perfecting. You would be able to play it much closer to the musical ideal that you have in your head. You would, as I say, spend a long time learning it. And it would be something that might be a bit of a stretch for you. It might be quite challenging as a piece. But the quick studies fall in between these extremes in that you don't spend as long learning them. There'll be probably things that might be able to play something a bit more difficult at a quick study than sight reading because you have more time to do it. And the quality, it might not be quite to the same extent of the repertoire that you learn in a more detailed way, but you want it to be as close to there as possible. That's what you're aiming for. So I said it's a shame that quick studies are overlooked and not done as often as they should be. So what are some of the benefits to doing a quick study? Well, firstly, it's a really straightforward way to tackle what I called in my previous video the technical difficulty arms race, in which we choose to play increasingly difficult pieces that outstrip our ability to play them and or the amount of time in which we have to practice and learn them properly. If you're under pressure in terms of the amount of time that you have to play a piece, then choosing an easier piece is far more conducive to being able to meet your goals and objectives, to learn it in that limited amount of time. It also forces you, by constraining the time that you have, to be more focused when you practice and to practice more effectively and efficiently. There's a term in project management speak called Parkinson's Law, and it states that work expands to fill available time. And so what that means is that even if you're trying to achieve something that should take you 20 minutes, but you have an hour to practice, you will often spend an hour achieving what could have been done in 20 minutes. It applies very much in the corporate world. I know this firsthand from my tribulations there, and also equally to pianists. So it just makes it easier to be more disciplined and to adopt that kind of a mindset. Because when you get into playing and when you're practicing, you'll be more likely to think, when you sort of wander off into aimless repetitions and things, you'll be more likely to think, no, actually, is this the best use of my time? Is this what I should be doing now? Because I've only got 2 weeks to learn this piece, as opposed to an indefinite amount of time. The other thing that the quick studies teach you to do is in practicing more effectively and efficiently, they help you develop the underlying skills that are required to learn pieces more quickly, which is a benefit that applies beyond the piece that you happen to be learning. Now, when I was younger and I was much more immersed in music, I found it didn't take me all that long to learn pieces, whereas as an adult with far less time, I find that things take a lot longer to learn. And I recently did a few projects where what I did was I did some sight reading on a regular basis, and I found even just doing sight reading helped me learn other pieces, learn my repertoire faster, because I was able to recognize patterns better and so on. I then went and did some chamber music where I had to learn, I think one of the pieces was a Mozart quartet, which is quite a lot of music to learn, and I had to do it in 2 weeks. And I had to cut some corners and be very effective in terms of how I practiced, because there was literally a date in which I was going to have to play this with other musicians, and obviously didn't want to make a fool of myself. But what I found after that was the next piece that I learned, which was an intermezzo by Brahms. I was really surprised as to how quickly it came together, because it just seemed easier to learn, and it seemed like the exercise that I'd done on the Mozart quartet, that it had left me with some kind of an improved capability to increase my rate of learning. Now, I played piano for a number of years as a kid and as a young adult, and the piano repertoire is vast, and as a result there's so many composers who I haven't played music by. So what's really nice about quick studies is that they're also a very effective way to fill gaps in your repertoire. And we tend to, if we want to play a certain composer, we tend to choose the pieces by them that are the most difficult. And not all composers write things that are accessible. I know there are a few. For example, there's not many pieces by Rachmaninoff that are accessible as a quick study. But I think that, there still are, for so many composers, you don't have to choose their most difficult works. There'll be things that are a bit easier. And even somebody like, for example, Chopin, there are a lot of his pieces could be seen to be sort of a grade 4, 5, 6 level. You don't necessarily have to go and play the first ballad or something like that. Then playing more music exposes you to more styles as well, and each style has technical difficulties and things that are useful beyond that style, and just makes you a more complete, holistic musician. And lastly, having more pieces that you can play for yourself is in itself a worthwhile endeavor, but having things that you could brush up, well, having the quick studies, I mean, you might not necessarily want to go and perform something that you've learned in a quick study immediately. You might want a little bit more time to brush it up, but at least it's not far from being another option for you to play and to share at a concert with others. So it opens up possibilities to play more frequently for other people, which is such a rewarding thing to do. And it really, I think for so many people who find themselves playing by themselves and in a rut, One way of getting out of that is to force yourself to play for others and to listen to other people playing as well. It's an incredibly inspiring, encouraging thing to do. So, having more pieces that you can play on command, or with a reasonable amount of notice is not a bad thing at all. So, some tips for embarking upon a quick study project. Firstly, choosing pieces. The one rule of thumb that I think was quite often used, and it's quite a simple way to do this, is I vaguely remember that for sight reading, the prescribed material was usually about 3 grades, 2 to 3 grades below what you were, the grade you were at. So if you were, say, grade 8, you would try and sight read grade 5 pieces, maybe 6 at a push. So you could do a similar thing for quick studies. I would suggest, I think a quick study you could probably do 1 or 2 grades lower, but I would suggest starting lower and going up rather than getting discouraged on pieces that are too difficult and then keeping on delaying your project because you've got to keep on trying to find new repertoire. Rather learn something that is perhaps on the easier end of the spectrum, because then you've got another piece to play. If it's something you wanted to play, why not? That's not a bad thing in itself. And then the next time you could do something slightly more challenging if you wish to. Although the object of this is not to choose challenging pieces, but it's just to enjoy playing more music. So examination boards are often quite a good way to do this, because even if you're not doing an exam, and there are some subjective criteria. I'm sometimes surprised. There's a piece, for example, in one of the examination boards, grade 1, that I think is probably grade 3. And there's pieces that I've seen in grade 8 that I think are probably grade 7 or 6. So, it is a bit subjective, but at least it is some measure of difficulty. And it's probably not going to be out by more than 1 or 2 years in terms of the grading system and your ability. So it's definitely worth having a look at those. Another thing you can do is, one way that I do this in terms of choosing music is I first sight read through the pieces. And so I have this sort of like what I call my R&D or discovery phase, where I find a few pieces and I play them as sight reading practice, and I play them probably horrendously. But if a piece is at a level where I feel, with just a bit of extra work and maybe focusing on a few difficult spots, it wouldn't take me too long to learn this piece. So if I could sight read it really badly, but with a bit more time feel that I could improve the quality quite significantly, then that's probably at quite a good level for a quick study. What I would just caution you to avoid doing, though, is there's a difference between that research and finding and discovering a piece and learning it. I think all too often what happens is we play a piece, we think, oh, that's nice. Tomorrow we just play the same thing again. We sight read it again. Then we sight read it again. And then we sight read it again. And every now and again work on a little bit here and there, basically learning bad habits as we go along. The approach that you adopt for sight reading, the approach that you adopt for discovering new music should be very different to that you adopt for learning a new piece. So there needs to be a line drawn between those two things. Otherwise, you'll just end up with a whole lot of fragments of pieces that you don't necessarily complete. Or when you do try and complete them or play them in a concert, you find that you've learned bad habits that take you even longer to unlearn. And you probably have been better off not sight reading through them at all. I would also suggest not going for pieces that are too long. That's one way to make sure that you've got something that's quicker to learn, or where there's a fair amount of repeats or duplication, than having to learn a whole lot of new material. And another possibility is you can work, if you have a goal to work towards, is to work backwards and say, well, okay, if I want to learn this piece in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, then reasonably, I should be able to play, let's say, the first 1 or 2 lines or the first subject or theme after 1 or 2 days. So you try that, and if it's just you tearing your hair out, then maybe the piece is a little bit too difficult. So working backwards from the goal and just being realistic about how much time you have and how long it's going to take you to learn is another way of just testing the difficulty. Now, some of the suggestions or tips for quick studies apply to repertoire in general, and in my original post on broadening my repertoire, I talked about some of these, and one of them is having goals to work towards. Now, the goal might just simply be to play the quick study in a lesson, It might be to play it in a performance. I mean, that's a bit more ambitious. You don't have to do that. Or you could do that as a follow-on from your quick study project. Or it might just simply be to record it for yourself. So you say, okay, I'm going to learn this piece, and in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to record it. Having that goal, even though, yes, this is not intended to be rigid or prescriptive or put you under, crushing pressure. But just having something like that that's tangible or defined to work towards means you're more likely to get somewhere with it. And even if you can't play the piece beautifully after 2 weeks, you might be a lot better with it than you would have been had you not set that goal. So goals are very important. The other thing is being very consistent with practicing. Now, I don't think that I think it's what a lot of people try and do is they'll spend an hour or two practicing over the weekend and then not during the week. Now, I know it's difficult because obviously not all of our schedules allow it, but it's amazing what you can achieve in just 20 minutes, or not even 20 minutes. Like, you have 5 minutes walking past the piano. Well, there's a way of getting something out of that. You don't need to play the piece from start to finish. In fact, the piece might be 5 minutes long. But what that forces you to do is perhaps be quite strategic about it and maybe find one specific passage and play it a few times over. So you do it 5 minutes in the morning, and then in the evening you do it for 10 minutes again. And you'll find that you're mastering something that usually would have taken you a long time to accomplish. This is very much ties back to what I was saying in the previous segment about Parkinson's law and being forced to be more focused. So being consistent with short, structured, focused practice sessions is really one of the ways of going about this. So I'm going to be using quick studies as a sort of a arrow in my quiver, if you like, to help me broaden my repertoire alongside pieces that I'm learning more formally that will be taking me longer to learn. So I'm going to have a mix of things, a mix of difficulties. And I'm going to go with 2 week quick studies. 2 weeks feels quite good for me because 1 week seems a bit ambitious. That was what we used to do in some of the exams, I remember. It's just that to practice every day is a bit difficult. Beyond 2 weeks, then things start expanding. So that feels like a good time for me to use, and I'm going to give that a try and see how that works. I'm going to work towards some goals, which will be to play some of the pieces, firstly just to record them for myself, to play them in lessons, and then also perhaps to play them for other people or in online meetup groups that we're running at the moment just due to the pandemic. The pieces that I'm going to learn will be things that there'll be a combination of things. Will be things I've always wanted to play or thought, oh, that's really nice, never got around to it. There'll perhaps be things that I've worked on in my work I publish resources for musicians, as some of you probably know. And it's a case of spend so much time on that and various other things that I never really get to play any of the things that are featured in the resources I've created. So this is a really great opportunity to go back to some of those pieces and actually play them. So I'm going to be sharing some of my progress, warts and all, what goes right, what goes wrong, mistakes I've made, just to see if that would be of interest and of use to anyone. I'm also going to share some of the tools and strategies that I'm using in my attempts to achieve this. Once again, these may be useful. These are often things that I've picked up and heard many times from a lot of the pedagogues that I'm really privileged to work with. But what I'm going to be showing you is how I'm applying these as the recipient of the information. Rather than somebody who's a subject matter expert. And I think, for me, this is a really interesting exercise because I've heard so many of these things so many times over, and yet the old habits die hard. So I've got to use this exercise to force myself to actually put into practice the things that I've been publishing and preaching for such a long time.